There he is, Derek Thompson, and very happy to have you back on the show. Always love when I talk to you. We're using a StreamYard app, which is not Zoom, but the same problem exists that you were just responding to someone tweeting about. It's difficult to elegantly end a Zoom call. That's an issue, yes?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I mean, I have never really known how to end not just Zoom calls and Skype calls, but also ordinary telephone calls. Like I do feel like it's just this long stream of, okay, well, it's great to talk to you. Yeah, great to talk to you. Yeah, well, we should do this more. Yeah, we totally should do it more. Okay, well, and there's just not this like there just needs to be some way for a little bit of like telekinesis to happen between the people's brains to be like, we both want this over in the next 5 seconds. Like, let's just say goodbye, talk later. So, and I just find for whatever reason, maybe just lack of familiarity, that it's especially hard with Zoom, that there's this, you don't really get a sense of people being able to wind down toward the end of the thought for some reason, not being like physically present with them. And as a result, I do this thing all the time where I'll say like, okay, and like draw out the A a little bit as if to indicate like my readiness to like stop.
That's not
but they're
subtle.
Like in the middle of a thought. Yeah, no, it's not subtle.
But people still miss it.
Lots of people.
Yeah, I think people miss the things that even that aren't subtle a lot of times socially. I think I've gotten very sensitive to it because I interview people for a living, but I also think a lot of people you're talking to aren't necessarily like taped interviews. So there's work related calls for your articles and so on maybe. But the point I think I elegantly end. We'll see at the end of our conversation. But what has happened to me? What has happened to me is that and sometimes the guests, especially using this new app or any different app, don't know how to technically end the call. So we'll say goodbye, and then awkwardly we'll just stare at each other while we're trying to get off the screen. Has that happened to you?
Right. Yeah. That's more akin to the physical world experience of like saying goodbye to someone and then taking a right around the building, and they take the same right around the building. And you're like, no, we still got a whole block worth of, so what are you going to do for lunch? How do you feel about that crack in the street? This is an awning over here.
I used to have that happen all the time when leaving SiriusXM Midtown building, saying goodbye, and then realizing both of us are parked at the same garage or going to the same subway. So I guess we'll just keep talking since we're headed in the same direction on the same sidewalk.
Yeah, I think what hell is, at least Christian hell, I'm a secular Jew, but hell is thinking that you're saying goodbye to someone, and then you realize that you have to walk for 3 years with them in one direction, and then another conversation you think is going to end right after that, and you're stuck for another 3-year-long walk. I can't find anything more toe-curlingly like uncomfortable than the sense of like, I've given you everything I have conversationally, and now it's just the dregs. But we still got this fucking block. And so I have to make up some observations about sky. Are those cirrus clouds?
That actually is what Derek Thompson, I can imagine, would say in those situations, as opposed to a lower brow, small talky thing that I might go with. You actually reference some scientific natural occurrence that's happening. But boy, hearing you talk about these kind of social situations only makes me love you that much more because you're such a nice guy and thoughtful. I would hate to ever feel that I've been in that situation and never want to take up too much of your time. And so I want to get to what you have been writing about at The Atlantic and sometimes tweeting about on the Twitter, where I think you're excellent. Before we get to your specific articles, because you haven't written anything about this, but I'm sure you have insight. Fourth wave, where are we at? What constitutes that? I'm hearing different things from the experts who you talk to and write about all the time. What is a fourth wave, and are we actually going to sustain one in America in different regions?
So it's interesting that you ask about the fourth wave because Zeynep Tufekci just wrote an absolutely fantastic article for The Atlantic. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right, about the fourth wave. And I just spoke to her about a related matter for The Atlantic. And I think that what we're seeing right now is a couple things. This is a race between the variants and the vaccines. That sentence is becoming a bit of a cliche. Everybody's saying it, but everyone's saying it because it's true. It's a race between the variants and the vaccines. The alliteration in this case is not just convenient. It also has the glint of truth. So here's the truth. The vaccines work. They work spectacularly well. They worked in the trials. They work in the real world. Every country that has used them and inoculated more than 25-30% of their population, Israel, the US, the UK, has seen massively declining hospitalizations, massively declining deaths, massively declining cases. That said, these variants are the real deal. It's not that the variants are going to overcome the strength of the vaccines, but rather that among the non-vaccinated parts of society, these things are really contagious, and there's a possibility they could be more fatal than coronavirus OG. So we have to continue to accelerate the vaccinations, because that is the only way that you deal with the variants and get back to normalcy. And I'm a huge fan of doing both. I am sick of these lockdowns. I am sick of having to eat outside at a restaurant, even though that is what I am happy to do during an outbreak. I want to go into bars. I want to get back to normal. The way to do that is to vaccinate faster, faster, faster. We're doing it. Let's go faster still.
Very well explained. The other development just in yesterday, talking about how effective the vaccines are. Apparently, the Pfizer juice is now proven to vaccinate almost 100% protection for young people, 12 to 16. Have you heard about that?
I heard about it. I read about it in the New York Times. I was talking to Pfizer and BioNTech for a story that I think we're going to talk about in just a second. Yeah. But I've not done official reporting on this. Let me just put it this way. This is not that surprising. It's not that surprising because you look at the clinical trial data for Pfizer, BioNTech's first vaccine for adults, it was spectacular. It was spectacular at blocking symptomatic illness, and it was beyond spectacular at blocking severe illness, death, hospitalizations. That was the clinical trial data. It's been shipped to Israel. Something like, more than 50% of the population Israel has taken it. They only had like 100, 200 cases, new cases of coronavirus yesterday. This is an amazing vaccine. So the fact that it works for late adolescents, teenagers is not surprising, considering that it's the same juice that we know works so well for adults.
It's not chewables. It's the exact same vaccine. My question, though, was, right, I suppose specifically, even though you haven't done reporting on this, you could take a ballpark estimate about when that becomes available, because first you get the scientific research and then go through all kinds of stuff, and then it gets rolled out. Do you have any idea about when that might be available for young people to take?
What I'm hearing, or at least inferring from Scott Gottlieb's public interviews, is that we want to vaccinate the, say, over 12 student population by this fall, which would mean we would start vaccinating
That's
early summer. And look, it's important, though, to keep this fact front of mind. This disease is an order of magnitude more dangerous for people in their 40s than it is for people who are teenagers, and it's several more orders of magnitude dangerous for people in their 80s, 90s than for people in their 40s. So while I'm a huge fan of accelerating vaccinations and beginning to make it eligible for just about everyone over the age of, say, 21 as soon as possible, we need to make sure that we are specially focusing on vaccinating older populations because they're so much more vulnerable. So that would be a reason why you wouldn't necessarily want to pull forward the vaccinations of like 12 and 13-year-olds, because this disease is simply not the same for someone about to have a bar mitzvah as for someone about to celebrate birthday number 80.
All really great points. I want to ask you about the pandemic mistake that America can't repeat. That's the title of a piece of yours that dropped in mid-March at theatlantic.com, which everybody should subscribe to. What is the mistake that America can't repeat?
So I wanted to write about, for the year anniversary of the pandemic, what was America's original sin in this pandemic. And I didn't know if people were going to talk about quarantines, or maybe they were going to talk about, having a president who actually believes in science. Everyone that I spoke to said it's about testing. We totally dropped the ball on testing. We have the infrastructure, however, to make testing a massive reality next time we have a pandemic. And the reason testing is so important, especially lots of early tests as the disease is beginning to spread, is to think about this. The reason why we had to shut down the world is because we couldn't see the virus. No one knew if Pete Dominick had it, if Derek Thompson had it, if their wife, child, uncle had it. We had to treat everyone as equally likely to be sick, and that militated the shutdown of the leisure hospitality public economy. But if we had the ability to massively test, then we would be able to see the virus as it was spreading, and we wouldn't have to lock down as much, because we could say, look, you can see the test, you can see where it's spreading, and you learn a lot about the disease. as you test more. I think that if we had been testing a lot in March, we would have seen very quickly that this disease is an airborne virus and not a fomite or surface virus. That means it's spreading through the air through tiny aerosolized particles. That means we should definitely be wearing masks. And so you wouldn't have had Fauci, I think, saying in the middle of March, oh, we're not really sure that ordinary people should be wearing masks. You would have said the opposite. This is an aerosolized virus. We can tell because of the testing. Everyone put your mask on. I think that would have saved lives. So for so many reasons, it's important to see an epidemic, especially at its exponential hockey stick moment.
It doesn't seem like that is the biggest hurdle, the developing and using of tests. It seems like the CDC just completely screwed it up because, my friend, Dr. Aaron Carroll, you write about this in your piece, that certain institutions with resources, they made their own tests in-house. If they had the money and the expertise, like, an institution with a medical school does, they can make their own tests and they can protect at least themselves. But the CDC is supposed to do that for America the way IU did it for their students and faculty. Am I right about this? And can we get it right in the future?
Yeah, I hope we can get it right in the future. I hope that the same way that, the human body forms immunological memory to a disease that it's already confronted, that the civic body of the United States can form institutional memory based on this pandemic. At the same time, there's no question that last spring was just a cavalcade of failures at every level. We didn't accept the WHO's offer to send some tests our way. The CDC said we could make the best test in the world. The test they made was contaminated and terrible. There were tests coming out of, for example, the University of Washington that seemed to really, really work, and the FDA dragged its feet in terms of greenlighting that test and allowing it to spread. So we messed up. And then, of course, the Trump White House, which, your listeners know how just absolutely pathetic that response was on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour
You have
level.
a great paragraph about it. I was trying to find it to read it, but you said it would seem almost, how's the word pronounced? Gauche? I know what it means. Gauche?
Oh, gauche, yeah.
To talk about the ineptitude of Trump, and it was so well articulated. Did I find
it's
it?
It's just the height of obviousness. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
The fact that Trump was an absolutely horrific leader during a pandemic, during a crisis, is beyond obvious. So I didn't want to spend too much time on it, and I don't need to spend too much time on it.
I'm glad that you did. It's important. I'm glad that you did. Trump was wrong about COVID-19 in almost every possible way that a person can be wrong about a thing. That's why I wanted to read it for those words that you wrote. And he burdened the entire public health system with mercurial demands and easy fixes and junk science. Yes, that paragraph was important to the article, but well said. You don't want to spend too much time on it. So in the future, hopefully the CDC and Robert, you won't have a Robert Redfield. That guy doesn't seem like he's going to come out of this unscathed.
No, absolutely not. People that I spoke to said that he is, right there under Trump in terms of the people that should shoulder the most blame. Trump did a terrible job consistently. Redfield, I think, was somewhat of an embarrassment. But unfortunately, it wasn't just limited to the CDC and the White House. There were failures across the board. And I'm not entirely sure why there was such systemic failure within the U.S.
Well, hopefully there will be an investigation into that. Do you think that's likely? Have you followed any of the talk about that? There should be an investigation into the January 6th. There should be an investigation into, obviously, COVID and the roots of what we're talking about. And I'm not sure there will be. It should be nonpartisan. It should be, not politicians. Do you think there's any likelihood of that?
I love the idea of having a committee that looks at best practices around the world. Not just an investigation into what the U.S. did right, but also, not just an investigation into what the U.S. did wrong, but an investigation into what Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia seem to have done right. You can add, Norway to that list. Denmark seems to have done a fantastic job at limiting spread. So I think there's a lot for us to learn. The world has never experienced something like this. I mean, this is like Armageddon deep impact stuff. A global catastrophe happened that every country felt in some way. Every country knew about it and was feeling this global pulse of catastrophe. Let's learn from that. I'm a huge fan of increasing global knowledge from this disaster.
Fascinating work as always from Derek. And you wrote a piece called How mRNA Technology Could Change the World. And in this piece, you reached out to the director of the Vaccine Research Center at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, my old job, John Mascola. And he told you that in the world of science, RNA technology could be the biggest story of the year, we didn't know if it worked, and now we do. You also reached out to Peter Hotez, who was suspicious. He's a friend of mine of the show. Talk to me about this very important article and more important research development that didn't happen overnight, right?
Yeah, so mRNA technology, synthetic mRNA, is the tech behind the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which were the two first vaccines to be authorized by the US government and the fastest vaccines to ever be authorized in the history of science. And so a lot of people, I think, are nervous about synthetic mRNA. It seems very new. They hadn't heard of it last year. So what the hell is this thing?
It's fake. It's not natural. Or is that what you mean?
It's Bill Gates. You know, he has this little tiny nanobots that he wants to like put in our bodies. Like that's the
give me some of that Bill Gates juice. Give me that Bill Gates juice.
Give me the Gates juice. So what synthetic mRNA is it's mRNA, which is essentially the recipe for our cells to make proteins, but it is edited in a lab so that we are sending instructions to our cells to make any protein under the sun. And so the protein in this pandemic that's so important to manufacture at scale within our bodies is the spike protein that surrounds the coronavirus. So if people have seen depictions of the coronavirus, they've probably seen it has little spikes coming off of it. In fact, corona means crown or crowned. Those crowns are spike proteins. The mRNA vaccines send instructions to our cells to manufacture these little spike proteins so that our immune system can recognize them, see them as enemies, enemy intruders, learn how to kill them, even though we're not getting sick at all from the virus, such that if we do encounter the virus at a later time, our bodies will recognize those spike proteins and attack them with the efficiency of a well-trained military. That is how vaccines work, right? They teach your body to recognize the disease before you're exposed to the full-fledged disease. mRNA technology does that in a beautiful, quick, nimble way. And this piece is about not only how it works for COVID, but also how it could work for the future of individualized cancer therapies and vaccinating against malaria.
Oh God, it's so, this article I was intimidated by, as I often sometimes am. You break it down as well, by the way, in a conversation as you do. Well, not as well, because there's more nuance in your article, obviously, but there's so much more to it. And it's a really important, I think, just for that final point you mentioned, the future of other diseases, other viruses, and specifically cancers. It's fascinating and it's very important. And I know I'm almost out of time. And I got to ask you, I love that how much you're interested in and seemingly obsessed with housing. It's such a fascinating, if it weren't, terrible for certain people, issue. And you've got I think it's your most recent piece. No, not your most recent piece. About, this is actually back in early March. This is unprecedented. Why America's housing market has never been weirder. What an interesting, fascinating article that it would seem that we still don't know some of the catalysts and some of what the outcomes will be, but it's important for a lot of reasons. One of which, that there are a lot of Americans at home buying age in their 30s, which matters a lot. But what do you think is so weird about the housing market?
So I think there's two layers of weirdness. The first layer of weirdness is that we are emerging from a recession. And in recessions, what always happens is that the housing market craters. In fact, that's what happened in the last Great Recession, is that it was caused by the cratering of the housing market. Well, in this recession, even though in some ways it was even more serious than the Great Recession, housing did nothing but boom. Home prices went up in every single metro in the top 100 metros. That is simply bizarre and unprecedented. And the second layer is that in a lot of areas like San Jose, Washington, D.C., New York, home prices increased, but rents plummeted by 20%. So people who were short-term found a way to move out of expensive cities, but people who wanted to buy often bought in the downtown or inner suburbs of these metros. We've never seen anything like the rent-buy splits that we've seen in the last 12 months. Never, ever, ever. And I talked to the chief economist at Zillow, and he backed this up. So what this, I think, speaks to is the fact that there's something that sometimes people say about this recession recovery that we're in right now called a K-shaped recovery. And the K, that's sort of forking at the K within the letter itself, represents the diverging fortunes of the rich and the poor. That for lower income people who tended to work as essential workers or working in the leisure and hospitality industry, in the restaurant business, they often suffered in terms of their physical health or in terms of their economic outcomes. But for high income people who could do their job from home. And here we are, two white collar workers, essentially, or no collar workers, essentially, talking to each other via telecommunications.
I consider myself a shed worker.
A shed worker. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we don't have to go out. I'm the last person to be in line for the vaccine. I'm actually getting the Moderna juice tomorrow. Can't wait. But yeah, I see to your point. We're doing pretty well.
And just to connect this to the housing market, because these higher income people that are working remotely and not having their finances pinched by the recession have all this money left over because they're not going out to restaurants. They're not going on those vacations. They're doing everything in-house. They've got money left over. So do
classes. I think it's a huge underscore. Sorry to interrupt you, but like your kids' sports or dance, in our case, it was a huge part of our monthly budget. And now it's not, much less vacation. So for a family like ours, it's probably pretty typical with teenage kids. That you're saving so much money on not spending stuff on the extracurriculars, if you will. Sorry to interrupt you there.
No. It's exactly the right point. I mean, the personal savings rate in this country just hit its highest level in 60 years. That's not just because of people in the bottom 20%. That's because a lot of people in the top 30%, top 10% just aren't spending a lot on the luxuries or the extracurriculars they used to. So where's that money going? Well, a lot of it is going into housing, into NFTs, into crazy stock plays. You're seeing the price of these assets being bid up. And I do think that the crazy NFT story and the crazy GameStop story and the weirdo housing market, the one underlying variable that is causing all this stuff to burble is the fact that high-ish income people are bored as hell and their personal savings rate has never been higher.
Get a hobby. Why America's great crime decline is over is the last article I want to ask you about. And I know I'm already over here, but you interviewed Patrick Sharkey, who's a really smart, sociologist. He's an expert on violent crime. And it would seem, if I were to try to encapsulate in a sentence, which is an injustice to you, that this has to do with certain areas of the country, certain neighborhoods and demographics, but overwhelmingly, and we can talk about Black men and the violence in Chicago and places like that, but overwhelmingly, it seems the one connecting thread, if there is poverty. Is that fair? Am I missing something?
I think that summarizing why crime rises and falls in one sentence is almost impossible. So
and disrespectful.
Just about it. No, not disrespectful. I think you did just about as good job as you can. This is a 5-paragraph answer to a very simple question. So I won't be able to touch on all of it. I encourage people to read this article and this interview with Patrick Sharkey. But let me summarize his position as essentially this. Last year was the most violent year of the 21st century. It saw the highest increase in violent crime of any year since at least the early 1990s and maybe since the 1960s. And more people were killed last year in gun-related shootings. Gun-related shootings, that's redundant, in violent shootings and fatal shootings than in any year in American history. So something very serious is happening right now, and we need to get to the bottom of it. And it is more complicated than, well, the crime wave happened after the protests, we blame the protests. And it is more complicated than just localized poverty. And it is more complicated than just last year was weird with the pandemic and everything else. It's complicated as hell. And so I encourage people to read the article because I think I do as good a job as I possibly could to lay out all the variables that are a part of this recipe of rising crime.
I'm here for all your work, but I do love it when you print kind of your back and forth interviews with experts, as you did with Patrick Sharkey. It's a fascinating and super important article. This is all of your work, and I'm so grateful that you had time to talk with me about it. Brilliantly explained, as always, Derek Thompson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.